It is my utmost pleasure to welcome here to the studio my co-host, Dr. David Bray. Let me introduce him to you.
Dr. David Bray is director of the GeoTech Center at Atlantic Council. He has served in a variety of leadership roles in turbulent environments and has accepted a leadership role to incubate a new global center with the Atlantic Council. Business Insider named him one of the top 24 Americans who are changing the world under 40. He also provides strategy to both boards and startups, espousing human-centric principles to technology-enabled decision-making in complex environments.
One of the 20 Americans under 40 changing the world. David, such an honor to have you with us at WebIt and being a co-host of this virtual event. Thank you.
Thank you, Plum, it's an honor to be here with you as well. And you're absolutely right. We have some very distinguished and impressive panelists today. And I'm really excited to talk about how we can use data and technology and people-centered solutions to build a more shock-resistant world. So I'm going to turn first to Vint and ask, what are both the biggest challenge in your perspective and the biggest opportunity when it comes to doing more people-centered approaches to creating a more shock-resistant planet?
So thanks for asking, David. Let me categorize these in 6 different ways. I'm sure this is not complete, but there is a social challenge, a social shock, which has affected us partly because of COVID-19 and all of its side effects. There's an economic shock. And that we have to cope with as well. There is a medical shock that is, of course, a primary front and center COVID-19 problem. There's a psychological shock, which is coping with all of this and adapting to very different conditions than the ones that we are accustomed to. And finally, just by way of example, there's a supply chain shock across many different sectors. And that's just 6 ways of categorizing things. I'm sure there are more that the panel might choose, but it feels to me like we have an extremely rich space in which to explore resilience in the face of shock of these various kinds.
Excellent. And maybe if you give us a quick rejoinder, so you outlined a really good framework to look at it. What would you say is the biggest opportunity? Obviously, you have experience with TCP/IP and making sure it's resilient for all sorts of circumstances.
Well, the first one is insight. I think this situation that we're in today is forcing us to see things that we might otherwise have either not seen or ignored. I mean, whether that is Black Lives Matters and the racial tensions or supply chain breakdowns or the increased dependence upon technology or trying to use online resources for education, for conduct of business. Literally, we have this powerful spotlight, which is highlighting a variety of brittleness in the system or strength in the system. And we should take those insights on board and then use them to decide what we should be focusing on in the future in order to improve our ability to recover from various and sundry kinds of shocks. But the situation is incredibly broad, whether it's economic or social or psychological or medical. One thing I will say is that technology is clearly a tool which we are heavily using in order to cope with a variety of these issues, not least of which, of course, is understanding the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the way in which it propagates and the impacts that it has, and figuring out whether there's any defense against it, which right now is looking less bright than I had hoped in terms of immunity, for example. Gosh, David, there's so much more to say, but every single person on the panel will illuminate your question, I'm sure.
Thank you, Vint. And I think that's a great setting of the scene. So now I'll turn to Divya. And Vint talked about shining a spotlight on multiple issues that need to be addressed. So I'll ask you the same question. What do you think is the biggest challenge? And Vint, of course, did a 6-fold, so you can do challenges, but also the biggest opportunity too.
Yeah, well, he set it up so beautifully. What's interesting is even though I kind of represent the medical profession, I'd say that while occupied with this current pandemic, one of our greatest risks is actually the problem of climate change. I feel like we're at this tipping point, and without a planet, without a resilient biosphere, biodiversity, and all the rest of it, we don't have anything. We don't have security from infectious disease. we don't have ways of securing housing and clean water or food security for billions on the planet. And then the most socioeconomically vulnerable are the first ones to suffer from all these conditions, including violence and threat to their being. Another thing I think we are risking in this time is that citizens will become increasingly fearful, right? And when we become afraid, we look to others outside ourselves sometimes to protect ourselves. And the obvious place is often to our leaders and to governments, but if they don't all act with those same ethical frameworks, so we can find ourselves in a place where people are giving away civil liberties for things like militarization of civil forces, and even surveillance in the name of survival. So it makes people feel like things are being done to protect them. But then you ask what the opportunities are, and I think, like Vint said, insight is one of them. And one of those insights is how interconnected we are. In fact, the way this virus spread around the planet should bring that home. And now here's where I am going to wear my doctor hat. I use the human body as an example because if we throw it out of equilibrium, so for instance, let's take diabetes. We throw its glucose sensing mechanisms out of whack. The entire system goes out of whack and it begins to over-respond and develop things like pro-inflammatory states. So now we have heart disease, we have cognitive dysfunction, all kinds of things go wrong. And so these larger than life responses are a reflection of the fact that the entire system is now out of harmony. And so what we need to do is think of our planet in this kind of harmonious system as a way that humans in disparate parts of the world need to be interacting to maintain this kind of beautiful equilibrium. And finally, if I might, I just want to say that this has also brought us an understanding of how data and tech can be used in the service of humanity in the biosphere. We can use this tech now to listen to and integrate the rhythms of the planet so we can develop early warning systems and ways to enhance resilience to sense things like future pandemics or coral extinctions or climate change. So I just wanted to offer those. For me, these are rays of hope.
I was uplifted. Go ahead, Ben. Yes, go ahead.
Jump in with a question. There is this notion of homeostasis. And if I remember right, there are genetic components of all this, and there are protein things that help do that. A Hox gene, if I'm remembering my little bit of biology right. Is that, do I have the right word? And is that the kind of thing that we're trying to create not only within our own bodies, but also in our environment writ large?
Divya?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think every complex system has these homeostatic set points. And when we exceed one of these set points in one direction or another, the entire system does everything it can to pull itself back to that state. And a lot of what we're seeing, I think, all of these crises that are exploding across the planet are a reflection of the planet saying to us, we've exceeded its homeostatic mechanisms and it wants to get back to its set point. And it will do so with or without our cooperation. So we might as well cooperate with it.
I'm reminded of, there's a poem by Yeats that says, turning and turning into the widening gyre, the falconer cannot hear the falconer. I think that's what we're sort of talking about here, is at what point are things past the point of being complex and now are entering chaotic states? And so I think you hit on a really beautiful metaphor, Divya, about thinking about what can we do to actually achieve more homeostatic conditions for societies, for people, and also for the planet as a whole. So I appreciate that. Thank you. I would now like to turn to Reggie. So Reggie, you've seen different lenses. What's your take on the biggest challenge or challenges, as well as opportunity in creating a more shock-resistant planet?
Yeah. Thanks, David. Vince started off with a framework I like, and so I want to talk to that, but I also want to talk about a different framework as well. So as was mentioned earlier, I was at DHS. One of the things that I really was concerned about was, how do I prioritize where we look? What kind of threats do we think about first? How do we make budgeting, right? I think many of you may be familiar with this framework of thinking about the probability of threats versus the impact of threats, right? And so, for example, the World Economic Forum has something that I look at every year. They come out with a survey, essentially, of what these threats are, the probabilities, the impacts. And as I was pondering your question before this, David, I was thinking, so really, what do I think is really one of the limiting factors here? And particularly given the context of COVID right now, I think one of the limiting factors is information. And the fact that the community's response to all these things is based on the information it receives. Mm-hmm. And my real concern is that this whole idea of the weaponization of information, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you look across a framework that Vint talked about, so technical, social, economic, medical, psychological, and supply chain, for all these to be effective, the community has to agree on what the basic facts are, right? We all have to agree on what's true. And that gets to my concern on the loss of the community of a community sense of root of trust, right? So as you know, information operations, all these kinds of things have been done throughout history. I think the challenge now in this domain of big data, right? You've got these things of volume and velocity and veracity, right? And variety. The big issue is veracity, right? How do we know what's true? And you start thinking about the volume and velocity of data right now. There's so many opportunities for disinformation. But not only that, if you look at what's going on in business, if you look at what's going on in the national security, national defense communities, where speed is of the essence and the speed of decision-making is so important, we're now including machines to help us make these decisions, right? And we all know that machine learning is brittle, and that's a whole nother conversation. The problem is now we have adversarial AI techniques, right? We have people poisoning data for machine learning. So now these things, even not just the humans, not only are we getting bad data ourselves, but the machines that we're using to help us make decisions can be making bad decisions based on bad data or bad sensing. So I think that's a concern I have. And in terms of opportunities, to me, that comes a lot to education, right? It's how are we thinking about critical thinking, right? How are we training ourselves and training the next generation to think through challenges, to think through what do you trust? Yeah, Vint, you got a question?
Oh, no, I was trying to signal David that I wanted to jump in after you.
So keep on going, Reggie, and then we'll circle back to Vint. But go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, so I think education is a big play here, right? Because we've talked so much recently about STEM education, these kinds of things, and that's great. But what we're really talking about is how do we make sure that we're teaching our communities how to think critically, how to start understanding what to trust. There's Walter Cronkite, 60s and 70s was the most trusted man in America, right? Okay. So you can go into arguments of why that was, right? And you could argue whether you need someone like that or not. But the question is, how do we as a community, I think there's a great opportunity right now to develop a framework for trust. And how do we develop our community sense of trust, not just in the in-groups, right, but the out-groups as well, right? So that's my concerns right now.
And I'll circle to Vint in just a second. I just want to connect what you said, Reggie, because I think it was so powerful talking about the weaponization of information, misinformation, how things can be taken out of context, and then also the pressures for speed and the recognition that there's machines in there. I was thinking about what Divya was talking about with the immune system, and sort of thinking about with that you can either cause receptors to be ineffective, or you can change the molecule that binds with the receptor. But just like that, we're also seeing with information, you can make communities less receptive to receiving certain information. They may be more receptive to certain things that they shouldn't be receiving, or they may even be that the information itself, when delivered, causes problems. And so we may also be needing to think about homeostasis when it comes to information. How do we balance the desire for free speech, but at the same time also recognizing if we don't agree on some certain foundation, we may not be able to move forward as society. And so go ahead, Reggie, if you had any thoughts on that real quick, and then I'll go to Vint.
No, I think it's a great point. In fact, when we're talking about homeostasis, I started thinking about how do you think about that, right? What is that homeostatic point in trust? We talk about it as this root of trust in computational systems. What is it in a community? There's a fascinating article I read in Harvard Business Review a number of years ago that was talking about trust. And they were talking about this whole issue of, that we are predisposed to, at birth to trust. And that this is something we almost passively trust. And they were advocating that we develop some sense of tempered trust. But again, this is based on education experience. And I think this whole thing of homeostasis makes me start thinking about, so what does that look like? What is this balance point, this point where we all have some root of trust that we can come to and have a basis for conversation and discussion.
Well said. Vint, you had a rejoinder as well?
Yes, I did. As Reggie was talking, I was thinking about one other element which may not have been highlighted here, and that has to do with incentives. Unless we share a common goal, it may turn out that even in the presence of trust and fact and so on, while we may be at odds with each other, we may be in conflict with each other. And of course, people who don't have the same incentives and don't have the same objectives may very well choose to color information and do everything they can in order to persuade others to accept as fact something which isn't, in order to fulfill some objective. In some sense, it's a bit shocking to see how diverse the goals seem to be. And maybe our problem is not merely getting truth on the table, but it's also finding a way to achieve some common goals, achieve common ground, as David almost often says, in order to have a common objective that we can all be working towards. In the absence of that, it's very hard to see how we will have a common direction towards a target of a better world for all of us.
As you know, Vint, I have battle scars and bled at that altar of trying to achieve common goals. But the research actually shows, so Anita Woolsey and Tom Malone have shown, diversity helps solve problems if you can have shared goals. But if you don't have shared goals, then things fall apart. So with that sort of view of taking a more systemic view and strategic view, Daniella, you, I know, have looked at massive challenges in trying to get people to work together from both a trade perspective and a food perspective. What do you see as the challenge as well as the opportunities creating a more shock-resistant planet?
Well, you know, it's interesting that the issue of homeostasis was raised. It's a fascinating discussion. I actually have a little bit more of a nuanced view of homeostasis, and I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that necessity is the mother of invention, and without necessity, we don't invent. And our biggest threat and our biggest challenge right now is our own inaction and our own hubris. So we always have to be careful with homeostasis that we don't remain complacent. And, you know, you think about it, the challenges that we're dealing with right now, they were, you know, yesterday's existential threats, things like COVID, climate change, supply chain, national security, cybersecurity, social injustice. These are not new issues. They were just ignored issues. And we deferred for a long time. As far as our biggest opportunity, I think like a phoenix, it's to rise out of the ashes. And you've seen this in so many different places and countries that have been war torn, and they've been able to rebuild from scratch. And I think sometimes it takes catastrophe to create true change and to break that hubris. So I want to just kind of give a rudimentary example of what I mean. If I were with a significant other and we shared a one-bedroom apartment and all of a sudden we found out we're expecting twins, we're not going to go. We're going to find out what suits our needs, and then we're going to figure out where the furniture goes after that. We're really unwilling at this point to let go of what I would call vestiges, policy vestiges, our own connection to what we think the world is supposed to look like, and take a moment to just kind of spitball and envision what it could look like in the future. So I think we need to be able to dissociate ourselves from all of these vestiges to begin with, and then create this new world, and then figure out what seems feasible and how we can move on these projects.
I really like that nuance, and I'll circle back because I think I see Divya and Vint, and I'm sure Reggie also has a thought. So maybe this will actually be setting the stage for our next conversation. I really like that sort of thought that maybe what we should be recognizing is that, like you said, you want to have some harmony, but harmony at the sacrifice of addressing the issues that really need to be addressed can sometimes be sweeping things under the rug. And let's be honest, I mean, there are historical and present injustices that need to be addressed. Climate change, we've been wringing our hands since, quite frankly, the 80s. I mean, I remember in 1991 doing projects on it. And so maybe what we really need to do is look at what COVID-19 has really been the straw that broke the camel's back. And what we really need to think about is maybe we're now in a cocoon, and we need to think about what's the metamorphosis that we want to have happen, getting to Vint's point about shared goals. What do we want to emerge out of this chrysalis, out of this cocoon to be? Are we a butterfly? Are we a moth? What is that? But thinking about metamorphosis towards a new harmonic state. Any thoughts on that, Daniela, before I go to additional rejoinders from the other panelists?
Well, yes, I find very often that people are looking for the perfect solution. And having worked in intergovernmental organizations and spending years, by the time you figure out the solution, the world's changed around you.
Right.
We're in a dynamic environment. You need to get in there, start working, not be afraid of failure, but be able to pivot and respond on your feet, quickly on your feet. And so that's why I think the word homeostasis bears a second longer conversation.
I like it a lot. Learn, do, and adapt versus stay in place. So Divya, I saw you had some thoughts on that. So would open your thoughts on where do we go from here? What do we do?
Well, I actually really want to respond to this whole homeostasis thing since I introduced it. So no, I appreciate what you said, Daniela, but I want to clarify, homeostasis is not the status quo.
Right.
We are not arguing for status quo. The status quo, frankly, sucks. So homeostasis.
We all have shared goals there.
Yeah, I mean, if I become diabetic, the status quo for me is eating cupcakes every day. Status quo is not what I'm saying we should go back to. I'm just saying that the system is telling us it's out of balance, it's out of whack. And the system is actually saying that the inputs and the outputs are completely imbalanced and that we need to do something about that. So in fact, getting back to homeostasis is often, it's often a crisis mode. It's often a change mode. It's often, basically the fodder for doing all the things that we on this panel are talking about. And resilient systems actually know how to send out signals to say that their balance has been upset. And that's what we're experiencing. That's the shock part of this system. And bringing us back to that state is actually going to require quite a bit of innovation and ingenuity. It's not going to be a stasis kind of thing at all. So I did want to clarify that and not to stigmatize
no, it's very helpful.
Stasis in that sense.
So Divya, can I then actually circle back to you with an additional question, which is if what we're looking for is a way to get those signals amplified to then help inform where do we go, what can data and tech do? I know you've given some thoughts. We've talked about an immune system for the planet, but other things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one thing to recognize is that the signals may come from places that we least expect it. So rather than simply, for instance, looking at contact tracing for something like a pandemic or positive COVID-19 tests, as you know, we both have friends who've worked in this space of doing things like analyzing sewage water and wastewater and actually sequencing viral RNA and finding that even when people are asymptomatic, they're finding a signal in their feces, essentially, right? So our shit's revealing, and it turns out, right?
I think that is the best quote of today.
Should that be my tweet at the end?
Yes.
Or, we might be we're instrumenting the entire planet. We're actually looking at it with satellites. We have learned so much about things like human migration, animal migration, even animal skin temperature. We can actually diagnose avian flu from space. We should be using all kinds of disparate signal streams because you have no idea where the signal is actually coming from. And the way I liken it is, now I'm going to wear my neuroscientist hat, your nervous system, even without you being completely aware of what it's doing, is taking all kinds of disparate signals, both within your body and from the external world. And it's finally turning them into one common signal modality, which is electricity, which is the thing that it understands. And the ability to take these disparate signals and turn them into something that can be integrated and then eventually acted upon is something that all biology is exquisitely sort of fine-tuned to do. I mean, even trees and plants can do that through interconnected root systems. What I'm arguing is that we ought to be using tech in the service of creating these kinds of network fabrics that can integrate these disparate signal sources and bring them in a way that might be common. But also, this is to Reggie's point, I mean, you're spot on with all this fake data, fake truth, fake news. Is there a way that we can do that and authenticate the signals that come in through these decentralized networks so that there isn't so much a hierarchy that it's going through? So we don't need Mark Zuckerberg to tell us what's true and what's not true. We actually have other systems that can authenticate data, and then we can create this sort of data fabric like our biological sort of nervous systems to integrate them properly.
Well said. I couldn't have said it better. So thank you, Divya. I'm going to real quick go to Reggie, then Vint, then Daniela. So how do you make sense of all these signals? How do you discern which ones you put more weight to? It's sense making. What are your thoughts on that?
So first of all, my first thought was going back to math, and going back to math from optimization theory. So you're starting to think. So Vint talked about goals, right? So start thinking about, so if you've got some kind of optimizer, right? You've got some goal you're trying to get to, right? And you on some kind of surface where you've got all these different bumps and valleys and stuff, you're trying to find the lowest point, right? And that's what this, and the conversation we're just having remind me of that, because we've got so much, as you mentioned, there's so much sensing modality that we can have right now. There's so much, the capability to communicate all this stuff. And if you start thinking in the future with computational capabilities as they're coming up, can you actually start thinking about optimization around these kinds of things, right? Where, as you mentioned, the variety of different kind of sensing you can have. Obviously I'm making this as I go, but it's fascinating, right? Because, with Vint's start off here with, we need different goals. Well, that's exactly what you do when you're trying to optimize something. And then when you've got all of these different kinds of inputs, can you actually do that? Can you create a goal or a series of goals where you can have this multi-level, multi-variable optimization kinds of things? It can be machine, it can be human, it can be hybrid, where you can actually start coming forward with some really interesting ways to reach this dynamic homeostasis point that we started the conversation with.
I love it. And let me ask a real quick rejoinder before I go to Vint. Do you see a future in which, because you mentioned machines and AI, could machines actually help humans set goals for communities and for societies?
Wow. The answer is yes, it's possible to do that. But want to be very careful about this. I can imagine taking substantial amounts of input and trying to figure out from that input what's feasible. We talk about optimality and things like that. What's feasible is important because it helps us figure out what we should do as opposed to not try to do. I continue to be a little bit skeptical of our mechanical systems right now, because they have brittleness in them and could mislead us and do mislead us from time to time. So I think I'd be a little careful. On the other hand, we do know that these optimization systems can take in an enormously large dimensionality space and help extract signal from that. But sometimes I think it takes human judgment to decide whether this is signal or whether it's noise.
I agree 100%. And maybe what we should do is recognize a future in which we remain people-centered and we don't lose agency, but maybe we can look towards helping community leaders and, dare I even say, possibly helping politicians be better informed about what's possible in the art of the possible across different goals.
Just to interject, modeling can turn out to be quite helpful and powerful. I mean, we've been asking our experts about the COVID-19 virus and a model of its spread and its effects. And so, but we know also that the models are, wildly varying depending on what they get as input. And so once again, we have to be thoughtful about which models we use to guide our decisions.
Right, and I believe it was Einstein.
David, if you allow me here, just a quick question we have here from the audience.
Sure.
And it is, it's Paul from London says, data is so imprecise, it can become meaningless. And the variables in collecting data can skew it in many different ways. The human element can also lie or not to be transparent with the truth as needed. People often say or interpret things as they think is expected from them. What Dr. Vint Cerf think about it? And do you think that with that lack of data, or actually data that can be matched fields from all around the world, we can still move ahead? And what is the solution?
Well, let me draw on Heisenberg for a moment and quantum theory and say, although I'm using it figuratively here, quantum theory is all about uncertainty. And it's all about our ability to create a world, a real physical world, in spite of the fact that when you get down into the quantum level, things are very uncertain. You don't know where anything is, or you can't be able to guarantee precision. And that is the situation we're in right now. When you look at the vast quantities of information around, some of it invented and some of it measured with imprecise instruments, we have uncertainty all around us. And it is out of that uncertainty that we want to derive direction. And we look for tools to help us to achieve that objective. But every single one of our tools, including our wetware up here, is not perfect. And so how do we extract, I won't say perfection, but how do we extract direction out of imperfect information? And that it requires experience. Not only does it require experience in the human sense, but it requires experience in the mechanical sense. So when we use machine learning, for example, we train these systems, that's their form of experience. But in every one of these things, we have to keep in mind that we do not have 100% certainty. And so judgment becomes a super important element in everything that we choose to do.
And real quick, Plum, I was actually, that was a really great question from Paul and in the audience. And I believe it's also worth recognizing you'll never have perfect information anytime you have to make a decision. But in general, even with biased data sets, whether they be biased data sets from nations or individuals or even people who are intentionally trying to provide misinformation, in general, there's still predictability in that bias or predictability in that irrationality. And so there's still value in hearing this, even if it doesn't turn out to be accurate. And one classic example is when you ask people to guess how many jelly beans there are in a jar of jelly beans, people will have wild guesses from being very low to being very high, but if you aggregate it, you actually converge to the more accurate answer. Another example is there are certain countries that claim they don't have any opioid crisis whatsoever, and they consistently say that, even if you know they do. But even then, you can actually account for the bias that they're presenting and still use that as accurate information. And so there are techniques that can still extract value. And it's also worth noting that Nobel Prize winner Herb Simon, who later went on to do sort of the early days of AI in the 1950s and 1960s, he did his PhD focusing on decision-making in public administration. And he said that in general, that they never venture past their existing status. And what you really want to do is give them enough data to actually give them an incentive to go beyond the existing status and actually explore the new normals. Sort of what Divya was talking about, which is don't see homeostasis as the status quo, but actually as a signal to do something different. Divya, I saw you had a rejoinder, and then I'm going to go to Daniella, then Vint, and then Reggie.
Yeah. Well, this idea of information coming in, what's noise and what's real signal, is actually really important for my field. So in neuroscience, actually, we do this at the level of the integrator, which we call the synapse, right? That's the place where nerve cells talk to one another. And here's something that a lot of people don't realize. Signals in the brain are incredibly noisy and chaotic. In fact, there's tons of noise in the brain. And it's precisely because of the noise at these connections that the brain is such an efficient computer. The brain uses tens of watts to compute, and the best computers we've had thus far take at least 1,800 watts, more like a hairdryer. And part of the problem here is that we're looking for precision in those bits in silicon that our wetware does not demand. And so there's an entire field of computing called neuromorphic computing. And one of the things it does is it seeks to emulate these noisy, chaotic signals that exist in the brain. And what I'm arguing is if the brain can integrate and do it with that kind of noise, we certainly are capable of doing it across the planet together.
Well said. Daniella.
I'm sorry, remind me what the question was again.
Oh, well, you'd indicated a rejoinder, but I think we're focusing on what can people do as action. And so I think we've addressed a little bit about what we can do on the tech side, what we can do on the data side. I know you're doing a lot of thinking about what can be done with tackling some really hard challenges on the global food system. So if you were to prescribe some actions, what would you recommend?
I got so caught up in Divya's response, and it was she's so engaging as always that I forgive me if I digress there. I think there are a lot of things that people can do, and I think some of them are actually pretty simple. Like many of the panelists here, I think one of the biggest challenges that we see here is so many of our institutions are hampered by the fact that people don't trust them to begin with. And why is that? And we have to delve down into that. And part of the problem I think that we have right now is people have become addicted to social media. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing because it's a very effective means of communications. But I'm reminded of my grandmother who quit smoking at the age of 75 and saved $10 a day. And after a year, bought a mink coat. I don't wear fur myself, but the point is, can we balance that with having real world experiences, reading more? And I'm talking for, if you're asking for the individual, what can the individual do? Is have a better education of what is going on in the world around us and inform ourselves better through authentic interactions. And I think that's critical. There's so many people that I see on social media that tear each other to shreds that in real life could actually learn quite a bit from one another and develop a relationship of trust. So at the very individual level, I think that's what we need to do. I think you can easily translate that, though, too, into our governments and intergovernmental agencies. And one of the things that was mentioned was data trust. I actually think part of the problem is sometimes we have too much data. So anytime you add in poisonous data into an otherwise good data set, you poison the entire well. So we really have to figure out what are the critical control points, what is the data that we absolutely need, and how do we ensure trust there to begin with, knowing, as you said with your jelly bean analogy, that there are some implicit biases, but we can figure those out once we get a good fact set.
Well said, and I like your that we need to recognize that we may have been putting too much reliance on media that is not creating of empathy or walking a mile in someone else's shoes. Yes. And if we're to get through the future ahead, we're going to have to be able to go outside of ourselves and at least have empathy and understanding of the experiences of others. Vint, I know you have
David.
Yes. Oh, and
if you
Tom is
allow
going to jump in, and then we'll jump to Vint.
Hate to interrupt you, but there are so many people asking questions.
Go ahead.
I have Benjamin Sutherland from The Economist. And he's asking a very interesting question about what are the advances in forecasting software systems. And this is very interesting because it's another interesting development in forecasting software systems that can predict likely unrest or uprising based on social signals like large data input and socioeconomic indicators, tweets, etc. So but this could be abused by non-democratic governments, obviously also. So what are the advancements? What is the take on the panel?
Sounds like Vint has a take.
I have a very specific response to that question. The Gallup company has been doing surveys for literally over 70 years now. They ask a dozen specific questions and have done on an annual basis. They do it in many countries around the world. They have found that that questions like "How are you feeling about your lives?" Are you feeling like they're positive or negative, and so on, is a leading indicator of unrest later on. So I would urge the person who asked the question and others who are interested to go to the Gallup website and look into their reports on the predictions of unrest, social unrest, especially based on these simple questions that they've been asking for a long time. But if it's okay, David, I wanted to come back to a couple of other things that you mentioned.
Sure. Before I circle back real quick, let me just give one quick rejoinder on this question, and we'll go right back to you, Vint. Is that the other thing I would say, Plowman, to answer that question, back in 2002, 2003, I was with the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program at the CDC. We were small, but we were there for really bad days. And one of the things that we had as an early warning at the time of SARS, at the time it was called atypical febrile illness, was the price of garlic went up tenfold in certain parts of China. And it's seen as a cure-all, and that was a signal that something odd was going on over there. I raise that because I think what Divya, Vint, Reggie, and Daniella are talking about is those things that used to be done either by public health or by the intelligence communities of the world, we really now need to do in a civilian space is look for other signals. So in addition to what Vint talked about, which is polls of people in terms of they are self-answering, what are other economic indicators or other imagery from space or from, as Divya was talking about, from actually the human body itself, that could give us signals in addition to psychometrics that indicate something odd is going on. And so it really is making that publicly available. And I see, Reggie, you have a real quick rejoinder, and then I'll circle back to Vint.
Real quick, simply because I want to give very concrete examples. A number of years ago, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency had a forecasting challenge. And in that challenge, they asked companies to come back with data sources and analytics to predict events. And one of the more interesting conclusions from that work was this variety of data sources is so important. So for example, to predict disease outbreaks, they actually used open table. And they found that data set provided a good predictor for diseases. So I just wanted to leave that with you.
Excellent. All right, Vint.
So this is in response to your wisdom of crowds point. I would like to draw attention to the stupidity of mobs.
Yes, crowds are not always smart.
we need to be careful about this. And let me give you an example. The garlic price example could easily have been misunderstood as a vampire attack in China. So
it might have been.
We should be very careful about what conclusions we draw from all this. Just one other point, and it has to do with how our society functions. What does our society value is a very important question because it determines incentives and intentions and everything else. Asking ourselves what our values are is a very important question. And by extension, there is something else that was mentioned earlier, I think by Daniella, and that has to do with our institutions. Not only do we not trust them, but it isn't clear that they are for purpose anymore. And it is time for us to examine those institutions and ask those questions. Do those institutions and their function meet the values that we now adopt today? And I see Daniella has a
I love that. And I could not agree more. And I think part of the problem that we have with these institutions is if you look at the decision makers around the table, they all have political baggage that they're carrying with them. So we're not going to be able to rely on these intergovernmental organizations to resolve our problem, just as much as we can't necessarily completely rely on industry that has a purely for-profit motive. Nothing wrong with that. They just need to be profitable.
Right.
Until we get rid of, undue influence, mistrust and distrust, purposely being floated out there, and any of the problems that you have within their domestic politics. So as long as those exist and you had bad governance, you're going to have bad governance when they convene together. And, one of the things that you and I talked about is what can we do? What can we do in the intergovernmental organizations and agencies? I think it's very difficult, and that's part of the reason why it takes 7 to 10 years very often to pass very basic initiatives that at the end of the day no longer are suitable for the times that we're living in.
And to build on what Daniella said, and then we're going to go to the lightning round, which is we want a world in which people have food, that water is clean, that we are striving for more equitable outcomes for all populations. And that may be a way of overcoming it. And it's interesting because that's what the research shows too, because I agree with you wholeheartedly, Vint. There is a word for non-smart crowds. They're called mobs, and they usually don't end up well. But it's been shown. They can have different incentives, they can have different value sets, they can even have different languages, although you have to sort of bridge the languages and actually reach a common narrative. It really is about what you said at the beginning about goals and outcomes. But now I'd like to turn to the lightning round and actually turn to each of you. We're now at about 7 minutes left and are interested in your thoughts about what are the takeaways that the people listening to this conversation can do. Because I think, as Daniella said, we can't rely on some leader in either the public sector or private sector to solve all of our challenges. It's on us to be the change that we want to see in the world. So I'm going to first go to Daniella, and then I'm going to go to Reggie and Divya and Vint. So you're on notice, Daniella. What are your 2 to 3 tweet-sized takeaways? We already heard from Divya that our craft is revealing. And so what else do we want to actually put forward as things that we want to think about as we move forward?
First tweet is, I think she's a different 4-letter word.
He did.
Thank you for breaking that. No, I'm kidding. The first tweet is my most ironic tweet, which is don't tweet. Stop tweeting, get off social media. It's a great platform to a certain degree, but have authentic interactions with the universe around you. Get to know nature, get to know people, understand them. The second one is learn civics and government processes, learn processes in general. How can you participate if you don't know what they look like and how they function? And the third one are 2 hashtags. Hashtag equal access to technology, because I think that will resolve so many of the world's issues. And I think Divya hit on that earlier. And hashtag don't fear disruption.
Very well said. Very well said. All right. So Divya, sorry, Reggie. So Daniella, for her thoughts, what are your thoughts about the actions that we could all do to be?
Yes, I'm gonna go back to Daniella's actually comment about authentic experiences. I'm gonna take this from experience I had. I'm from Boston, and we had some racial issues going on, and the African American and Jewish communities in the early 2000s wanted to come together, and as they had during the civil rights times, and we decided on a simple action. And that simple action could be described by a hashtag of "Go have lunch." Right? That's really what we did. What we said was, look, we can talk about all these policy issues and all that, but until we get to know each other and understand someone in a different group, we're really not going to be able to work together. This is exactly what Danielle was talking about, and I feel very strongly about it. So I really recommend, even this time of COVID, whether it's virtual lunch or something, it's important to get outside of your in-group and start to meet other folks and just start understanding where they're coming from, because we're all human. And I think what we find out is once you start getting in someone else's shoes, you start understanding why they think in a different way you do. And that becomes an important way to start to collaborate on some of these important issues we were talking about.
Well said. And I think you may have put down a gauntlet for Plum, and we would love to see if maybe WebIt Virtual starts doing a break bread together activity where maybe we actually bring people around the planet, whether it's to have lunch, breakfast, or dinner. We can use these sessions to actually share a meal and actually begin to like you said, reach across different groups that are not our in-group. So sure. Thank you, Reggie, for that.
I would like to say a big thank you to all of you, and to reflect on the words of Daniella. She said something that definitely reflects with our wonderful community. Necessity creates innovation. I will go even further with your permission, Daniella. I would say communities are built around shared necessities. And I've heard you, that was I hate that moment when I have to wrap up, because I would have loved to listen to this panel for the next many hours. But definitely there were some clear messages going out there. The lack of trust in institutions. I would hear the lack of trust in media in general also. And this together builds up to, most probably, to something new. And we hope we're going to be having you with us in the coming months and years. So we really follow.
Real quick though, if we could real quick, we still need to get Divya and Vint. I don't want to let them off the hook. They still have to give their real quick short takeaways, if that's possible, and then we can wrap up. So Divya, real quick.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Danielle and Reg. Everybody's talking about trust, and that's not something we've talked a lot about today. But I truly believe that in order to connect institutions, leaders, community, we have to recover our narrative and our ability to tell one another's stories in order to engender trust. And then just to build on this idea of homeostasis in the planet as a way to build harmony and healthy connections, I would say that our planet's sending us all kinds of signals. The Earth has always had this sort of conscious network to integrate these signals. She's listening. Can we build a similar network to integrate these signals?
Well said. And I like what you're talking about in terms of recognizing that we do have to sort of reclaim narratives that can bring us together. And maybe that can be linked to what both Reggie and Danielle was talking about, which is understanding and walking a mile in someone else's shoes and breaking bread with them. Vint, you have the final word.
Well, first of all, if you walk a mile in somebody else's moccasins, by the time you're done, you are a mile away from them, and you have their shoes. So,
I want their shoes back.
First of all, on the edge of chaos lies opportunity. That sounds like a T-shirt, at least, if not a tweet. Second, I remember writing a speech when I was in high school as a valedictorian. It was called "In Praise of Discontent." And nothing changes unless people are not happy with the status quo. And so we're back to a very important dynamic here, which is not to be satisfied with where we are, but to press on to do something else. And the last point I want to make is something Reggie highlighted. If you're going to learn about other people and to learn to understand them, you have to start with a measure of respect. If you have no respect for them, then you have no incentive to learn about them. And so we need to help people understand that they should respect others so that they can have that interaction.
I'm thinking of the great words of Aretha Franklin there when you come to an event. It's all about RESPCT. So thank you for emphasizing the importance of respect. Thank you all for being amazing panelists. I think what I heard, if I could sum it up in 3 words, we needed to talk about insights, empathy, and then, as Vint said, respect. With that, Paman, thank you for the entire WebIt team for hosting this, and I'll let you close out.